Hello, my name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. I'm very pleased today to have another interview as part of the AI and COVID-19 Disinformation Initiative. It's a project with the support of the OSC Office, the Representative on Media Freedom. Today, we're joined by someone who has a lot to say on the intersection of AI, COVID disinfo, and freedom of expression. We have Owen Bennett, who is a Senior Policy Manager at the Mozilla Corporation. Owen, great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Kyle. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So Owen, let's get started on this. I think I'd like to get your feedback and your understanding and what do you believe are the key challenges right now raised by digital disinformation during the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think on this front, my answer is probably going to be a little bit underwhelming because I think it's worth situating the current kind of infodemic within the kind of broader context of disinformation that we're facing at the moment and in general. So obviously disinformation has been, particularly in the online sphere, has been around for many years. And it really started to take off as a subject of policy concern, political concern, research concern, around the time of the 2016 US election, because that was one of the key moments when we started to really see how online services could be manipulated, weaponized, and actually really start to engender significant real world changes that people thought were of a kind of policy interest. So in that sense, the pandemic and some of the misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing around coronavirus is really just the latest manifestation of that trend of disinformation and misinformation spreading through the online sphere. So while I think it's concerning and it's been concerning for many years, I think the policy challenge and the solutions that we need to think about and the kind of things we need to be conscious of when solving for it have to really changed. Whether it's electoral disinformation or disinformation about vaccines or disinformation about where the virus came from, it is all part of the same policy problem, and it's all going to require more or less similar solutions to try and address it.
So this is great. We're getting into solutions now, and there's been a lot of talk about how AI might be used to address these challenges. What are your thoughts on the role of AI in addressing misinformation online?
Yeah, so AI in general and automated content recognition and content detection technologies, this has been kind of at the cornerstone of how people, or many people, think that we should address some of the online harms around content, whether it's disinformation, but also things like hate speech and other forms of kind of problematic and objectionable online content. And for many years, we have, as Mozilla and many of our partners, have kind of raised the flag on this and basically tried to underscore that automated solutions are not a panacea when it comes to addressing problematic content online. They can work in certain discrete cases, particularly where the context where it's illegality doesn't depend on context. And I'm thinking particularly in situations which concern child sexual abuse material, where there is no context in which that content could be legal, and therefore relying on automated technologies can actually be relatively effective in the fight against that kind of type of content. However, more broadly, it becomes much more difficult, particularly because pretty much every type of content, the harm or the way in which it becomes problematic depends on context. And a really interesting example that we saw on this in the pandemic was early on during the first wave. Companies like Facebook sent many of their content moderators home because they weren't able to ensure a COVID work-safe environment, and as a result had to rely much more heavily on the automated content recognition and content deletion tools. And as a result, we saw a lot of important, legitimate public interest content being taken down by mistake because of the over-reliance on AI filters. So I think that the pandemic has shown us what we kind of already knew, which is that AI can play some degree of role, but it's never going to be the panacea, which some people might argue that it is.
So this is fascinating. Governments, as you mentioned, are also getting much more interested in the issue of disinformation online, and are starting to put some pressure on companies to do more. You're in Brussels. The EU has been doing some really interesting work, passing legislation. but I'm wondering from your perspective, what are some of the measures that governments are doing to fight disinformation that should really be highlighted outside of the AI space?
Well, so first of all, I think the big challenge that we face in the fight against disinformation as it manifests online is just a lack of data. Like even today, despite the fact that this problem has been on the agenda of many folks for a number of years, we still don't really know how and why disinformation is spreading through the infosphere, and like how different types of technologies and different types of products can enable and can engender that spread. And so I think if ever we're going to get to a point where we have good and effective and rights protective solutions to this problem, we need to first of all have that prerequisite insight. We need to have transparency into how the problem is manifesting and who it's harming. And so in that sense, you've seen quite a few governments and quite a few co-regulatory initiatives focus on trying to address this transparency problem, whether it's through the mandating of, for instance, ad archive APIs, where platforms are obliged to disclose the types of advertisements running on their platform and how those advertisements are being targeted, or more broader regimes around auditing, where regulators or public interest researchers have a chance to look under the hood at how online systems are working and trying to get a better sense of how disinformation and misinformation may be spreading through those systems. So like I think that's a good step forward. I think we're never going to get to true accountability until we have that prerequisite transparency. Obviously, that's not to say that there's not other solutions on the table. That there is quite a few problematic solutions being proposed, whether it's through industry like voluntary practices or through things that are being mandated by government authorities. And so it is a constant kind of effort and struggle to make sure that we give this problem the due recognition it concerns, but that we're putting forward the policy solutions that actually are going to make a difference in the long term and protect the open internet and people's rights.
So Owen, this is fascinating, and I've heard this from a lot of people about the transparency. We need data. We need to understand, calls for public audits of algorithms. All these things, they're fascinating. I'm wondering, from your work being in Brussels, are you in these talks? How important are the issue of human rights? How often do they come up? And is it just about freedom of expression, or is there a whole other set of human rights that people are talking about in these discussions?
I think human rights is still playing a important role in the conversation. Obviously, I think that in the EU we have the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and like when you look at all of the legislative texts, at least in principle, conformity with the Charter of Fundamental Rights is always a prerequisite in EU law. I think there is a growing recognition, and this has been kind of emerging in the last couple of years in the EU policy discourse, that the internet in and of itself and online like platforms in general are not necessarily an obvious enabler of fundamental rights, in the sense that obviously they can provide a lot of benefit and provide a lot of empowerment, and they really enable the exercise of fundamental rights. But at the same time, when these platforms are misused or abused, they actually can have the opposite impact. And a lot of rights abuses can be engendered by poor practices online and misuse of services, particularly in the context of disinformation and misinformation, where it can really interfere with the right to receive and impart information, and it can have a lot of consequences in terms of media freedom and people's ability to access reliable quality information. So in that sense, I feel that the policy discourse here has moved more towards trying to ensure that the online ecosystem retains that role as an enabler of fundamental rights, and recognizing that it actually can be abused, and there's ways in which the internet today is not particularly healthy, and the law and policy should aim at trying to correct for that to ensure that rights can be better protected. Now, obviously, that doesn't always work out, and we have to be incredibly vigilant in that effort to make sure that the law doesn't overextend or doesn't kind of venture into domains which actually can have a corrosive impact on fundamental rights. But I think that's something that we're as Mozilla and some of our allies and partners are trying very much to influence that discourse.
So, and my last question, and it might seem redundant because you kind of answered some of the points in that last one, but I would ask you, fundamentally, what can governments do to protect the right to freedom of opinion and expression while countering digital disinformation?
Well, there's quite a lot of things that can be done, and I think that some of these solutions are going to be obviously very short-term ones, kind of knee-jerk things, and there's also quite a few longer-term things which governments need to really be thinking of, even if they don't generate the key press release headlines or the key kind of outputs today. Like, I'm thinking particularly in context of encrypted messaging apps. And this is something which has really popped up in Europe in the last couple of months, but it has been a phenomenon in places like India and Brazil previously, where governments are looking at encrypted messaging apps and identifying them as key vectors for the spread of disinformation. And as a result, saying that perhaps we need to clamp down on the use of encryption because we need to be better able to police how online encrypted messaging apps work. And I think while well-intentioned, those kind of approaches can actually be quite problematic, because the problem is not with encryption in messaging apps. Very often the problem is with a lack of user functionality. Like, users don't have the ability to report when they come across misinformation on, say, a group chat or an individual chat. And also very often people don't have access to a quality media literacy tools. And investing in media literacy, obviously, it doesn't sound very glamorous. It's not going to move the dial straight away. But I think in the longer term, it's something which is going to be fundamental if we're really going to protect human rights and ensure that we actually get a better grip on the problem. Because ultimately, one can regulate Facebook and one can regulate Twitter. But if you have a media and if you have a broader information ecosystem, which is still suffering or still at risk of spreading misinformation and disinformation, you're never going to solve the problem. So you need to kind of inoculate your citizens, almost, to borrow some of the pandemic language. But I think more broadly in the shorter term, with disinformation, there is a kind of a tendency to think this is a problem about content. And this is a problem about people seeing things on Facebook and on YouTube and on other platforms, and that influencing how they view the world. And therefore, we need to get rid of this bad content. And I think the kind of approaches which optimize for that can be incredibly rights interfering. The reason being is that very often the harm of misinformation is not because of the content, but rather it's because of how much the content gets seen, who it gets seen by, and under what instances. And so very often you can end up taking down, but by trying to focus on the content, you end up taking down a lot of legitimate expression, or expression which may be harmful in some instances, but in other instances is not. So for that sense, we believe that kind of focusing on systemic transparency and focusing on ensuring that platforms recommend better and have better processes in place for addressing the kind of systemic problems is going to be a more rights protective and actually more impactful way of solving for the disinformation problem online.
Owen, I want to thank you for taking time of your busy schedule to talk to us today. It was fascinating, a lot to think about, a lot for policymakers to understand in more depth. Once again, Owen Bennett of the Mozilla Corporation. Owen, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.